In March 2007, from its headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, the second-largest electronics retailer in the United States made a decision that broke the foundation of American tech retail. Circuit City fired 3,400 of its most experienced salespeople in a single day. Their only offense was that they were too good at their jobs. Earning wages, the company suddenly decided it no longer wanted to pay. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Less than 24 months later, the company filed for bankruptcy. By 2009, all 567 remaining American stores were closed, permanently wiping out 30,000 jobs. The glowing red plug logo that had defined suburban shopping malls for decades simply went dark. For a generation, Circuit City was the default destination where families went to touch the future, where they bought their first personal computer, their first CD-ROM, and their first big-screen television. But the retail giant did not collapse because people stopped wanting gadgets. It collapsed because a multi-billion-dollar empire willingly threw away the only thing that kept its customers coming back: human expertise. America did not stop buying electronics. It stopped walking into Circuit City to buy them. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Richmond, Virginia, in 1949. The American technology retail empire did not begin with computers, and it did not begin in Silicon Valley. It began with the television, and it began in Richmond, Virginia. In 1949, America was entering a post-war economic boom, and the living room was about to change permanently. The radio, which had been the center of home entertainment for a generation, was being displaced by a glowing box that displayed moving pictures. But in the late 1940s, buying a television was a complicated, intimidating process. These early devices were not thin sheets of glass. They were heavy pieces of wooden furniture containing fragile cathode ray tubes. They required roof antennas, specialized installation, and frequent hardware repairs. You could not simply put a television in a shopping cart. You had to buy it from someone you trusted to explain how it worked. That year, a businessman named Samuel Wurtzel was on a family vacation in Richmond when he learned that the city was about to get its first local television broadcasting station. He recognized an immediate market inefficiency. The broadcast signal was coming, but the local retail infrastructure was not prepared to sell the hardware. Wurtzel opened the first Ward's Company store on Broad Street in Richmond. It was a modest storefront focused entirely on selling those early televisions and home appliances to a public eager to see the future. For the next 2 decades, the American electronics market operated through these small, fragmented shops. A town might have a dedicated television dealer, a separate stereo equipment shop, and a different store entirely for washing machines and refrigerators. These mom-and-pop stores were severely limited by physical space. A typical local retailer could only fit 3 or 4 television models on their showroom floor. If an American family wanted to compare brands or find a better price, they had to drive across town, relying on the word of a single salesman who likely charged a heavy markup on a highly limited inventory. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the technology industry began producing a massive wave of new consumer goods. Color televisions became a standard household expectation. High-fidelity stereo systems, complex setups with separate receivers, heavy turntables, and massive wooden speakers became cultural necessities for younger Americans. The volume of available technology was expanding rapidly, but the physical stores selling it were still operating on a cramped 1950s footprint. The American consumer wanted choice, but the retail ecosystem did not have the physical square footage to stock it. In 1968, Ward's Company went public on the stock exchange, giving it the capital to experiment with a new kind of retail distribution. Under the leadership of Samuel Wurtzel's son, Alan Wurtzel, the company began looking for a way to break the bottleneck of the small American electronics shop. They studied grocery supermarkets and early discount chains, realizing that the future of technology retail would require a completely different scale. In 1977, Ward's company launched a radical retail experiment. They opened a massive 40,000 square foot location in Richmond and called it the Circuit City Superstore. To an American consumer in the late 1970s, walking into this building felt like stepping into an industrial future. It was a hybrid concept, half warehouse, half showroom. Instead of a cramped, dimly lit shop with 3 televisions, the Circuit City Superstore featured wide, brightly lit aisles. Dozens of televisions were stacked floor to ceiling. The store carried every major brand of stereo equipment, endless rows of speakers, and a massive selection of major household appliances. More importantly, the inventory was physically in the building. A customer did not have to look at a single floor model, place a catalog order, and wait 3 weeks for factory delivery. If a family had the money, they could walk in, point to a massive color television, and a clerk would bring a boxed unit out from the back warehouse room, ready to be loaded directly into the trunk of a station wagon. It was the invention of instant gratification in consumer electronics. The superstore model was incredibly capital-intensive, requiring millions of dollars to build and stock. But the volume of sales it generated was unprecedented. By aggregating every form of electronic entertainment under one roof, Circuit City became a destination. A father could look at refrigerators while a teenager tested out a new stereo receiver. It turned the purchase of technology from a tedious chore into an event. The format was so overwhelmingly successful that the company began aggressively expanding the superstore footprint across the United States. In 1984, the company officially abandoned the old Ward's name entirely, rebranding the corporate entity as Circuit City Stores, Inc. They introduced a visual identity that would become permanently etched into the American suburban landscape, the red plug. The logo was not just printed on paper. It was built directly into the architecture of the stores. The front entrance of a new Circuit City building was constructed with red geometric blocks, designed to look like a giant electrical plug extending out toward the parking lot. The red plug on the front of the building became more than a logo. It was a physical promise. It signaled that this building contained the power, the hardware, and the inventory to upgrade a family's life. The foundation was set. But Circuit City did not conquer the American mall just by building bigger boxes. It conquered the market by figuring out how to sell the most complicated machine ever introduced to the American home. The physical size of the superstore solved the problem of inventory, but as the 1980s arrived, the American consumer faced a new, much deeper problem: complexity. Technology was rapidly evolving from passive entertainment into active, highly technical machinery. It was the era of the VCR, the camcorder, the advanced home audio receiver, and most importantly, the personal computer, a computer designed for one person to use directly, usually at a desk or in a home. Before this era, buying a household appliance was relatively simple. A refrigerator kept things cold. A washing machine cleaned clothes. But buying a personal computer in 1985 was a terrifying prospect for the average American family. These machines cost thousands of dollars, and they required the buyer to understand an entirely new language. A customer suddenly had to know the speed of a processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions. They had to understand memory, fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running. They had to know the difference between a floppy disk and a hard drive, a storage device that keeps files, software, and operating systems even after the power is off. Traditional department stores like Sears or Montgomery Ward were equipped to sell lawnmowers and winter coats. Their floor staff had no idea how to explain a computer's operating system. On the other end of the spectrum, specialized computer boutique shops were deeply intimidating, often catering only to hobbyists and engineers. The American public was eager to buy the digital future, but they needed a translator. Circuit City provided that translator, by making the most important strategic decision in the company's history, the commissioned sales force. Unlike the minimum wage clerks at a standard discount retailer, Circuit City salespeople were highly trained professionals who earned a percentage of the profit on the items they sold. This financial incentive fundamentally changed how the retail floor operated. A Circuit City employee did not just stock shelves or point toward an aisle. They were financially motivated to learn everything about the hardware. The company heavily invested in training, putting new hires through rigorous product education programs. Before a salesman was allowed to sell a camcorder or a stereo receiver, they had to know exactly how it worked, how it connected, and why one brand was better than another. This created a powerful dynamic on the showroom floor. When an American family walked into a Circuit City in 1988 to buy their first desktop computer, they were greeted by a sharply dressed professional, often wearing the company's signature burgundy jacket. The salesman would walk the family to a brightly lit display, sit them down at a keyboard, and explain exactly what the machine could do for their children's homework or their home business. The salesman acted as a trusted consultant. The family felt safe spending $2,000 because a human being had patiently guided them through the anxiety of buying new technology. But human expertise was only half of the breakthrough. The other half was invisible to the customer, buried in the store's back-end infrastructure. To manage massive superstores filled with thousands of high-value items, Circuit City developed one of the most sophisticated inventory management systems in the American retail industry. They built a custom, real-time point-of-sale network that connected the cash registers on the showroom floor directly to the warehouse in the back of the building. When a customer agreed to buy a heavy Sony television or a Commodore 64 computer, the salesman did not have to leave the customer's side to check if it was in stock. They punched the product code into a floor terminal. Instantly, a dot matrix printer in the back warehouse printed a pick ticket. A warehouse worker grabbed the boxed item and placed it on a rolling conveyor belt that led directly to the front registers. By the time the customer walked to the front of the store and pulled out their credit card, their massive, heavy technological purchase was already waiting for them, ready to be wheeled out to the parking lot. This combination, expert human consultation on the floor and frictionless, automated fulfillment in the back, created a retail moat that competitors simply could not easily copy. Circuit City had cracked the code of selling complex technology to the masses. They became the primary distribution channel for the greatest era of hardware innovation in history. When Sony wanted to introduce a new format, they needed Circuit City. When Nintendo released a new game console, a dedicated hardware system built entirely for playing video games on a television, it was stacked high in the red plug stores. As software companies began selling boxed software in retail aisles, Circuit City devoted massive amounts of square footage to PC games, productivity suites, and educational CD-ROMs. They were no longer just selling televisions. They were selling the entire ecosystem of the American digital transition. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the company aggressively expanded, stamping its red plug architecture across suburbs, highway intersections, and strip malls in almost every major state. They drove local mom-and-pop stereo shops out of business, absorbing the entire consumer electronics market into their massive, brightly lit boxes. The company had perfected a system that relied on human knowledge, vast inventory, and premium customer service. For 2 decades, if an American family wanted a desktop computer or a big-screen television, Circuit City was the default address. By the early 1990s, Circuit City had transformed from a highly successful regional chain into an unstoppable national retail juggernaut. The glowing red plug architecture began appearing outside of virtually every major American shopping mall and along highly trafficked suburban highways. From the sprawling commercial strip malls of Ohio to the sunlit retail corridors of California, the company was opening new locations at an aggressive, calculated pace. The timing of this expansion was flawless. The 1990s introduced a golden age of consumer electronics, and the American living room was being completely rewired. Circuit City was no longer just a place to buy a refrigerator or a heavy wooden television console. It had become the physical distribution hub for the digital media revolution. Consider the music and movie aisles. As the compact disc, a digital optical disc data storage format, completely replaced analog cassette tapes, Circuit City built massive, brightly lit media sections right in the center of their stores. Consumers would walk in intending to buy a dedicated CD player, but they would leave with 5 new albums. The company leveraged this foot traffic masterfully. They frequently sold popular CDs at a loss, using them as a loss leader, a retail strategy where a product is priced below market cost specifically to draw customers into the store to buy other, highly profitable items. A teenager might walk through the sliding glass doors just to buy a cheap Nirvana album, but their parents would inevitably wander over to look at a high-margin camcorder, a bulky home theater receiver, or a new microwave. Then came the home video game boom. When the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and eventually the Sony PlayStation launched, Circuit City devoted entire rows to the console wars. A game console, a dedicated hardware system built entirely for playing video games on a television, required expensive extra controllers, memory cards, and physical plastic game cartridges or discs. Circuit City salespeople, motivated by their commission structure, were experts at bundling. They rarely let a customer buy just the console. They sold the hardware, the games, the extra cables, and the extended warranty, maximizing the profit margin on every single transaction. But the true engine of their 1990s dominance was the personal computer. As the internet began to take hold, the PC transitioned from a luxury item to a strict household necessity. Connecting to the web required a modem, a device that translated digital computer data into analog signals to travel over standard copper phone lines. It required an operating system, like Windows 95, and it required boxed software, physical cardboard boxes containing floppy disks, or CD-ROMs along with thick, printed installation manuals. When an American family decided they finally needed to get online for a home business or a child's homework, they did not buy a computer through a website. They drove to Circuit City. The superstores featured long, crowded aisles of beige desktop towers from brands like Compaq, IBM, and Packard Bell. The commissioned sales force guided anxious buyers through the terrifying complexity of megabytes, processor speeds, and dial-up internet access. The company was literally teaching America how to plug into the web, acting as the trusted bridge between the Silicon engineers in California and the family desk in the Midwest. The cash flow generated by this retail engine was staggering. By 1993, Circuit City was producing so much capital that its executive team began looking for entirely new industries to disrupt. They realized that their core competitive advantage was not necessarily electronics. Their advantage was their proprietary system, expert commissioned salespeople, computerized inventory tracking, and massive superstore lots. That year, Circuit City's leadership looked at one of the most frustrating retail experiences in America, the used car market, and decided to apply their algorithm to it. They launched CarMax, a subsidiary that sold used vehicles with transparent pricing, computer-tracked inventory, and professional consultants. It was an astonishing flex of corporate power. An electronics retailer had essentially engineered a multi-billion-dollar automotive empire from scratch, simply because their internal retail operating system was that dominant. Circuit City was untouchable. They were not just participating in the American technology boom, they were the toll booth through which the hardware had to pass. By the late 1990s, Circuit City's dominance was not just a retail phenomenon, it was a Wall Street legend. Between 1982 and 1997, the company generated cumulative stock returns that outperformed the general market by an astonishing margin. When management researcher Jim Collins published his landmark business book Good to Great in 2001, he selected Circuit City as one of the 11 elite American companies that had successfully transitioned from average to extraordinary. They were placed alongside corporate titans, validated by financial data that proved their model, expert commission sales, deep inventory, and massive suburban real estate was practically flawless. But the true scale of Circuit City was not measured in financial textbooks. It was measured in the American weekend ritual. On a Saturday afternoon in 1998, a Circuit City superstore was a sensory overload of the future. Walking through the electronic glass doors, a customer was hit immediately by the ambient hum of electricity and the smell of warm plastic, ozone, and fresh cardboard. To the left, a massive wall of CRT televisions, heavy, deep cathode ray tube displays that weighed over 100 pounds, blared the same movie on 60 different screens. In the center aisles, families gathered around the camcorder displays, testing out optical zoom lenses and watching themselves on small, closed-circuit monitors. The company was also driving the next massive wave of home entertainment, the DVD player. As the market shifted away from analog VHS tapes, Circuit City dedicated massive floor space to digital video. A DVD player, a device that read digital optical discs to deliver high-resolution movies, required a complete rethinking of the living room. Suddenly, consumers needed surround sound speaker systems, optical audio cables, and specialized receivers. The commissioned sales force thrived in this environment, expertly guiding a customer from a single $200 DVD player purchase into a $1,500 complete home theater package. Simultaneously, the software aisles had become towering monuments to the dot-com boom. Before the internet became fast enough to download large applications, software was a physical object. It came in large, heavy cardboard boxes, shrink-wrapped and stacked on metal shelves. If an American family wanted to install a digital encyclopedia, upgrade their word processor, or play a graphically intense PC game, they drove to Circuit City, picked up the box, and read the system requirements printed on the back. The salespeople navigated this technological chaos with total authority. They knew which beige compact desktop tower, a vertical computer case designed to sit on the floor or a desk, had enough RAM to run Windows 90 smoothly. They knew which parallel cable was required to connect a new Hewlett-Packard inkjet printer. They understood the early digital cameras that stored photos on floppy disks. They were not just ringing up transactions. They were architecting the digital infrastructure of the American home. For millions of families, this physical retail space was where the abstract concept of technology became a tangible reality. In an American house where the family computer once sat in a shared room, the right device did not merely run software. It decided who could go online, who could talk after school, who could make a mix CD, who could work from home, and who felt that the future had finally arrived. Circuit City controlled that gateway. By the turn of the millennium, the company operated over 600 stores across the United States. They employed tens of thousands of highly trained specialists. They had successfully navigated the transition from analog stereos into the era of the personal computer, the CD-ROM, and the digital home theater. They had built an ecosystem that felt completely integrated into the fabric of American consumer life. If a device had a plug, a battery, or a screen, America bought it under the red sign. They possessed the most profitable real estate. They commanded the most knowledgeable staff. They operated the most advanced inventory system in the retail industry. Inside those brightly lit aisles, Circuit City built a retail empire that felt permanent. But behind the glossy red facade, the floor under their feet was already beginning to move. The collapse of Circuit City did not begin with a bankruptcy filing, and it did not begin with the internet. It began with a seemingly rational corporate decision in the year 2000. That year, management looked at their massive, brightly lit showrooms and realized that major household appliances, washing machines, dryers, and heavy refrigerators, took up too much physical square footage and required expensive delivery logistics. To improve profit margins, the company decided to stop selling major appliances entirely. The strategy was to replace the appliance section with more lucrative, fast-moving technology, personal computers, video game consoles, and a rising wave of small consumer electronics. On a corporate spreadsheet, it made perfect financial sense. In the physical reality of the American retail ecosystem, it was the first devastating crack in the foundation. Major appliances were anchor items. They were the primary reason an entire American family got into a car on a Saturday morning. A couple would come into the store to replace a broken refrigerator, and while they were at the sales desk financing the purchase, their teenagers would wander the aisles, eventually convincing their parents to buy a new CD-ROM game, a portable CD player, or a pair of stereo speakers. By ripping the appliances out of the store, Circuit City fundamentally changed the reason people walked through the sliding glass doors. They handed millions of loyal, high-spending families directly to their closest rival, Best Buy. Best Buy was operating under a completely different retail philosophy, and they were exploiting the exact weaknesses Circuit City didn't realize it had. The most critical difference was the human element. For 20 years, Circuit City's commissioned sales force was its greatest asset, guiding terrified consumers through the complex transition into the digital age. But by the early 2000s, the American consumer was no longer terrified. Technology had become standardized. An American teenager no longer needed a highly trained specialist in a burgundy jacket to explain how a digital camera, a portable device that recorded images to flash memory cards instead of physical film, worked. The average buyer already knew how to connect a basic DVD player to their television. Furthermore, the arrival of the MP3 player, a pocket-sized device that stored thousands of digital audio files on an internal hard drive, required very little explanation. The high-pressure, commissioned sales model that had built Circuit City suddenly felt aggressive, outdated, and unnecessary. Shoppers began treating the red plug stores like a free library. A customer would walk in, ask the highly knowledgeable Circuit City salespeople for detailed advice about a home theater system, and then immediately drive across the street to Best Buy to purchase the exact same item in a low-pressure, self-serve environment from a minimum wage cashier. This psychological shift was amplified by a severe real estate trap. Because Circuit City had expanded so aggressively in the 1970s and 1980s, much of their physical footprint was rapidly aging. They were locked into rigid, long-term leases on smaller, 30,000 square foot buildings, often tucked into decaying suburban strip malls with terrible parking layouts. The store interiors felt dark, cramped, and reminiscent of a bygone era. Best Buy, arriving later to the national market, was building massive, 45,000 square foot standalone warehouses on prime real estate, right next to major highway off-ramps. Circuit City was trying to sell the sleek, flat-screen future in buildings that felt definitively stuck in the past. The strategic errors quickly began to compound. As the video game industry exploded into a multi-billion-dollar cultural force, the market shifted heavily toward a secondary economy, trading and buying used game discs. Circuit City's management ignored this entirely, viewing used games as a low-class, flea market business that did not belong in a premium technology store. By refusing to enter the used market, they left massive profit margins on the table and allowed specialized chains like GameStop to siphon away the lucrative repeat foot traffic of young American gamers. At the same time, the broader market forces of retail and distribution, what we can identify as Force 2, were turning fiercely against them. Big box discount stores like Walmart and Target expanded their electronics aisles, selling basic printers, cables, and boxed software at prices Circuit City could not possibly match. The company was being relentlessly squeezed from below by discount retailers and completely out-hustled on the premium side by Best Buy. Then came the shadow of Force 4, the slow, creeping displacement of physical convenience. The internet was evolving from a slow dial-up hobby into a high-speed broadband utility. An online retailer named Amazon had survived the dot-com crash and was quietly training the American public to buy DVDs, CDs, and eventually digital cameras and laptops with a computer mouse instead of a car key. The fundamental need for a massive physical store to simply browse and discover technology was beginning to evaporate. By 2005, Circuit City's revenue had flatlined. The stock price was volatile. The corporate boardroom was in a state of constant panic, initiating a series of executive turnovers, store remodels, and desperate rebranding efforts that ultimately failed to bring the massive crowds back. The company still had hundreds of stores, tens of thousands of employees, and billions in annual revenue. But the ecosystem around them had fundamentally broken. The brand was bleeding out, rapidly losing its default status in the minds of American shoppers. But the company was not yet dead. To survive the brutal new reality of the retail market, management decided they needed to execute a drastic, immediate reduction in their operating costs. The foundation of the empire was fracturing, but the fatal blow would not come from a competitor. It would be delivered entirely from the inside. In March 2007, the executive team made the single most destructive retail decision in modern American business history. To satisfy Wall Street analysts and execute a drastic reduction in operational overhead, Circuit City fired 3,400 of its most experienced, highest-earning salespeople in a single morning. The corporate leadership called it a wage management initiative. These were not underperforming employees. They were the veterans. They were the men and women who knew how to build a complex home theater, how to network a PC, and how to close a high-margin sale. They were immediately replaced by part-time minimum wage workers who received virtually no technical training. This decision was executed at the exact moment American technology was undergoing a massive, highly confusing transition. The heavy, boxy CRT televisions were being rapidly replaced by flat panel displays, thin screens utilizing LCD or plasma technology that could be mounted directly to a living room wall. The transition to high-definition video required consumers to suddenly understand new technical standards, like 1080p resolution, and new hardware requirements, like the HDMI cable, a single digital cord that transmitted both uncompressed high-definition video and audio. Simultaneously, the heavy desktop computer was being aggressively displaced by the laptop, a portable, battery-powered personal computer that integrated the screen, keyboard, and trackpad into one folding unit. The American consumer needed guidance more than ever. They were walking into stores prepared to spend $2,000 on a radically new digital ecosystem, and they needed someone to explain how it all connected. When an American family walked into a Circuit City in late 2007, they were no longer met by a knowledgeable professional in a burgundy jacket. They were met by a minimum-wage teenager who could not explain the difference between a plasma screen and an LCD, or why a specific wireless router was necessary for their new laptop. The customer would look at the expensive hardware, look at the unhelpful clerk, walk out the sliding glass doors, get back into their car, and drive down the highway to Best Buy. Circuit City had unilaterally destroyed the only competitive advantage it had left: user trust. Sales immediately fell off a cliff. The company's internal ecosystem completely broke. A big-box retail store is a delicate machine built on momentum. Once the foot traffic stops, the inventory stops moving, and the cash flow dries up. Then, in 2008, the American economy collapsed. The Great Recession evaporated consumer discretionary spending overnight. Families stopped buying luxury electronics and focused on survival. But for Circuit City, the economic crash triggered a far more lethal mechanism in the back end of the retail supply chain. Major big-box retail operates entirely on credit. Hardware manufacturers like Sony, Samsung, and Hewlett-Packard do not demand cash up front when they deliver thousands of laptops and televisions to a retailer's warehouse. They provide the inventory on short-term credit backed by third-party credit insurance. As Circuit City's sales plummeted and its stock price collapsed to less than $1, the credit insurers panicked. They officially withdrew their coverage of the company. The physical result of this financial maneuver was devastating. Overnight, the major global hardware manufacturers refused to ship new technology to Circuit City unless the company paid in cold cash before delivery. Circuit City did not have the cash. By the fall of 2008, the reality of this financial crisis became visible to the American public on the showroom floor. If a customer walked into a store looking for a new Nintendo Wii or a specific high-end television, the shelves were simply empty. You cannot sell what you do not have. Empty shelves led to fewer customers, which led to even less cash, which led to even fewer product shipments. It was a fatal, irreversible loop. On November 10, 2008, Circuit City filed for Chapter 11C, their Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The executive team hoped to restructure the debt, close underperforming locations, and find a buyer to save the brand. But the American retail ecosystem had already moved on. No corporate buyer wanted to take on the massive real estate debt, the outdated strip mall stores, and a deeply shattered public reputation. The brand had become toxic. On January 16, 2009, the bankruptcy court approved the complete liquidation of the company. Over the next 2 months, the remaining 567 American stores hung massive yellow "Going Out of Business" signs over their iconic architecture. The remaining inventory was slashed to clearance prices. The store fixtures, the metal shelving, and even the computerized cash registers were sold off for scrap. 30,000 American retail workers lost their jobs in the middle of a historic recession. The inventory stopped arriving. The shelves emptied. The customers drove away. The vendors cut the credit. The stores locked their doors. The red plug went dark. The knowledge was gone. After the final stores were locked and the inventory was liquidated, in the spring of 2009, the physical assets were gone, but the intellectual property still had residual value. In a bankruptcy auction, the Circuit City brand name, trademarks, and e-commerce rights were sold to Systemax, a company that had also purchased the remnants of CompUSA. They acquired the name for just $14 million, a fraction of the billions the empire was once worth. Systemax relaunched CircuitCity.com as a generic online electronics retailer. It was the ultimate example of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products or services that no longer reflect the original promise. The website sold cables, hard drives, and basic peripherals, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the original company. There were no massive showrooms, no computerized warehouse tracks, no burgundy jackets, and no human expertise. It was simply a digital ghost occupying a familiar domain name, attempting to capture accidental search engine traffic. Eventually, even that iteration faded away, leaving the Circuit City name as little more than a corporate footnote. But in the physical world of American suburbs, the empire was much harder to erase. You cannot easily hide over 500 massive, custom-built superstores. Today, a unique online preservation community known as Retail Archaeology actively documents the physical remains of the company. Across YouTube and collector forums, enthusiasts track down the surviving architecture. Many of the old buildings were sold and retrofitted into fitness centers, auto parts stores, discount grocers, or evangelical churches. But because the company's signature red plug was physically built into the brick-and-mortar facade, the new tenants often simply painted over it. The geometric shape of the plug remains, jutting out toward the parking lot, hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, vintage technology collectors actively hunt for the smaller, more personal artifacts of the empire. At estate sales and thrift stores across the country, you can still find pristine Circuit City receipts from 1998, tucked safely inside the manuals of old Windows 95 computers or early digital cameras. Former employees preserve their burgundy jackets, name tags, and training manuals. There is an active online market for the old point-of-sale signs, employee training VHS tapes, and the promotional CD-ROMs that once played on endless loops in the software aisles. This preservation effort is not simply nostalgia for a defunct retail chain. It is a physical documentation of a massive paradigm shift in how the American public interacts with technology. Circuit City represents a specific era when the future was heavy, expensive, and deeply intimidating. Buying a personal computer, a home theater system, or a camcorder in 1995 was a major household event. It required a physical destination and a human translator. The superstore was the necessary bridge between the Silicon engineers in California and the family living room in Ohio. The average American could not simply download an explanation of a processor or an operating system. They had to drive to a building and ask a professional to explain it to them in person. Today, that bridge is gone because it is no longer necessary. The friction of buying technology has been entirely removed by the internet and the smartphone. If an American consumer wants a new piece of hardware, they do not drive to a superstore, walk down an aisle, and ask a commissioned expert for advice. They watch a video review, click a button on a glass screen, and a cardboard box arrives on their front porch 2 days later. Software is no longer bought in a heavy, shrink-wrapped box from a brightly lit aisle. It is downloaded silently in the background from a cloud service. We traded the physical, communal ritual of discovery for the invisible speed of absolute convenience. Circuit City's fatal mistake was forgetting what they were actually selling. The executive team looked at spreadsheets and believed they were selling televisions, computers, and cables, assuming those boxes could be sold by anyone for a lower hourly wage. But the hardware was always just the byproduct. What the company was actually selling was trust, expertise, and the feeling that an American family was safely navigating the digital frontier. When management fired the people who provided that trust in order to save a few dollars on the balance sheet, they destroyed the only reason the store existed. The customer lost the expert, the hardware lost its translator, and the building lost its purpose. The market moved online, the hardware shrank into our pockets, and the massive showrooms were left behind. Somewhere along an American highway, a faded red outline still marks the brick wall of an empty building, a silent monument to that once taught a nation how to buy the future before the future learned to arrive in a cardboard box at the front door. See you in the next one.